Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing and the Sword Study series. So today we're going to be looking at a 1796 Trooper's Sabre, which is probably the most iconic British military sword. But what makes this one a bit unusual is just it is lighter than average. Now, when it comes to officers' swords, we're so used to seeing such a wild specification. But when it comes to Troopers' examples, if you look through masses of data on them, you will tend to find some pretty basically standardized spectrums of weight and balance and that kind of thing. This one is unusual. And if I take it out of its scabbard, so standard steel service scabbard, you can already see, if you're familiar with 1796 Troopers Cavalry sabres, what makes this slightly unusual is that normally they flare here at the tip and have basically additional striking power, additional mass in the tip here. And this one just doesn't really have it. It has pretty much even profile taper along its blade length. So here it is a completely standard, typical 1796 Trooper's sword. And there's no evidence whatsoever that it was an officer's sword. Now, it doesn't mean it wasn't necessarily. We know there were Trooper's swords used by officers with little to no embellishment. So there's always a possibility that it was an officer's sword and made that way for a reason. There are other reasons it could have been made light as well. So certain volunteer yeomanry swords were made a little bit lighter than standard regulation army swords. Well, I don't think we're ever necessarily going to know. Now, the maker's mark on the back, it's basically slightly worn down, but it says something in Sergeant. And unfortunately, Sergeant worked in collaboration with so many different makers over so many different years. Because the first bit is worn down, and I don't think we're going to be able to read it. A friend of mine who owns this, maybe he can look more into that, but I don't know if you're going to be able to read it. But whatever it is, and Sergeant's, that could date it to the early 1796s or decades after, because Sergeant was in business for a long time. So we can't exactly date this one. Anyway, what I'm going to show you is an unusually light example of a 1796 Trooper's sword. Now, it still has a forward balance. It still very much is a very cutty sword. It feels still what you'd expect of a decent cutty light cavalry sword. But it simply is a little bit lighter than average. So most light cavalry sabres come in, the Troopers examples, between about 900 and 950 grams. This one is 780. Now, I've actually seen and handled and own officers' sabres that are very much in that range. But even for a cavalry officer, that would be light. That would be the lighter end of the spectrum. So this does feel much more like some of the nimble officers' light cavalry sabres that I've handled. Now, again, it's worth noting that officers' sabres varied a lot. You can find cavalry officer sabres that are as heavy as the Trooper swords and even heavier. But a lot of them were significantly lighter, and that's what this handles like. This handles like a lot of the officer examples that I've seen. And as you can see, it's lacking in that profile taper. It's just not it's not sort of flared out. It's a narrower profile. So let's have a look at the specification. The blade length is 83 centimeters, or just over, about 83.2. It's 32 3/4 inch. And the regulation for light cavalry was 32 to 33. So this is within regulation size. And if we look at the balance, you'll notice already the balance is very much what you'd expect of a light cavalry sabre. If I can get it to actually sit still, it is 16 centimeters. So that's quite forward weighted, although not as extreme as some. Light cavalry sabres, the British ones, tend to be around about 18 roughly centimeters forward. So this is 16. Again, just a little bit more nimble than most Troopers examples of this form. Let's have a look at the profile taper. 3.62 at the shoulder, at about the halfway point down to 3.1, and in the last sort of 15 centimeters is down to 33. Okay, so you can see it does actually flare a little bit. It's barely noticeable where it flattens out here. Like most light cavalry, British light cavalry sabres, as the fuller stops, the blade goes completely flat. We're going to see that now in the distal taper. So with the distal, looks nice and thick. 8.2, Halfway along the blade is down to 3.9. In the last 10 to 15 is 1.4. And right there at the tip, it's down to 0.6 millimeters. As I've said, some British cutty swords of this period can be very thin here down at the tip. They tend to be fairly wide, but very, very thin. Okay, so let's have a look at the curvature. Despite the fact that it doesn't flare much in the tip, it does otherwise look pretty typical in terms of its curvature. So as ever, if you want to take the curvature of a sword, line up the tip and the back of the spine of the blade on a straight line, and then measure the widest point to the direct straight line. So it's 6.5 centimeters. Pretty typical for a British light cavalry sabre of the time. So they're known as a well-curved sword, and they are well-curved, just not as absolutely outrageous as, say, that 10 centimeter Shamshir craziness that I showed in a recent video. So there you have it. There is a 1796, definitely British-made light cavalry trooper sword that is just a little bit more agile, a little bit lighter, a little bit more nimble than we typically think of for the type. As ever, I like to look for what is typical specification to understand what different models of swords were like, but it's always fascinating to see those outliers that show you a vast range of what was actually out there. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Please do subscribe if you haven't already.